Thousands of years ago, long before the term cryptid or tales of the Loch Ness Monster were told in Scotland, Native Americans roamed this divine land and spoke of a mythical lake serpent in Lake Erie. Tales of sea and lake monsters go as far back as storytelling goes, whether it be a violent kraken, a giant squid, or a large octopus. People have been telling stories for years about monsters that live in the waters and attack ships and the mariners that guide them. When I was a kid, I was fascinated by cryptids, as most children were. Whether it be Bigfoot, or the Jersey Devil, or the Mothman, I watched hours and hours of content on the History or Discovery Channel that talked about these strange beings that roamed this land. So naturally, I eventually looked up cryptid tales from around the Great Lakes. You have the Michigan Dogman, the Underwater Panther, the Wendigo, and even our own Yeti that roams the north. But the most famous one of all was a lake serpent named Bessie. Bessie, of course, is just the name modern Americans gave it for reasons I will reveal later. And yes, it's partly because Bessie rhymes with Nessie, but that's not the whole reason. The first written sighting of the Lake Erie monster goes all the way back to 1818, and the first oral history of it goes all the way back to 1793. While the first written sighting of Nessie only dates back to 1933, that means the Lake Erie monster predates the Loch Ness Monster by at least 115 years. So this particular cryptid is not just a copy and paste of another cryptid. It has its own unique place in the cryptid hierarchy. Early accounts have Bessie ranging anywhere from 15 to 60 feet. It slithers around the waters like a snake, while it's been described as having a brownish-gray color. It specifically roams the South Bay of Lake Erie near Ohio, where there's a small archipelago of islands that go out into Lake Erie. This is also near Sandusky, Ohio, in the famed theme park Cedar Point. But as I did more digging, I found that Native Americans had been talking about a gigantic water serpent not just in Lake Erie, but all over the Great Lakes for hundreds of years. Indigenous people even created mounds to serpent monsters, and considered them a higher power. Right here in the Midwest, we actually have the largest serpent effigy mound in the world, and mounds in the shape of large serpents can be found all over the Midwest and span across several Native American tribes. But obviously, if you ask most scientists, they'll tell you the thought of a gigantic lake serpent that hides underwater only to come out and terrorize mariners is preposterous. We would have scientific proof of it by now, and wouldn't just hide underwater for it to never be discovered. How could this species sustain all these years without anybody noticing gigantic lake serpent eggs at the bottom of Lake Erie, the shallowest lake of all the Great Lakes? Unless you believe that there's only one Bessie and it's immortal, which really defies the laws of science. People have sailed up and down Lake Erie with sonar, looking for any proof of lake monsters like Bessie, but to no avail. Like I said, the tales of a Lake Erie monster predate Europeans ever coming here. Native Americans spoke of a Bessie-like creature for years and has lived on through oral histories. So, as I always do, I wanted to get to the bottom of this strange piece of history that is native to the Great Lakes region. A tale that asks the question, is it history, or is it folklore, or is it nonsense? As I explained in my very first Tales of the Great Lakes video, indigenous people first found the Great Lakes after the Ice Age, and after large glaciers created basins in the earth, and then melted to make what we now know today as the Great Lakes. There are several eras that historians will refer to in North America before European contact, and where our story starts today is in the Woodland period, which lasted from 1000 BC to 1000 AD. During this time, a specific culture of the early woodland period called the Adena culture lived around what we now know today as the Midwest. The grand majority of the Adena people lived in present-day Ohio. They are known as the Adena culture because the 6th governor of Ohio, Thomas Worthington, built a stone mansion in Chillicothe, Ohio, and around this property, he found a rather peculiar-shaped mound. Worthington said he named his mansion Adena because it was based off of, quote, places remarkable for the delightfulness of their situation, unquote. He also said that Adena was a Hebrew word, but when I looked up the name of Adena, it said that Adena actually means slender or delicate in Hebrew. And I'm not sure why he'd refer to his property as slender or delicate. Maybe he was confused about the actual meaning of that name, but I digress. This mound that Worthington discovered was one of the first of thousands of indigenous-built mounds identified around the Midwest, and due to the link the specific mound had to Native Americans, historians and archaeologists then called the people that built these mounds around Ohio the Adena people. Now, why would indigenous people be building mounds all around the Midwest? Well, indigenous mound building in the continental United States dates back all the way to 3500 BC, with a mound in northern Louisiana called Watson Brake. There were mostly hunter-gatherer tribes around the United States during this time that historians called the Archaic period, and Watson Brake even predates the Egyptian pyramids. It is generally not agreed upon what caused Native Americans to build mounds like Watson Brake, but evidence suggests people lived around the mound mostly from summer to fall, and they'd hunt and fish around this mound. One theory also suggests that indigenous people would come to these mounds to worship their deities and pray for good weather. Also, some think that when looking at certain points of Watson Brake, that lines up with the winter and summer solstice, meaning these early Native Americans could have used it as a marker for when summer and winter were going to come. When evidence of Watson Brake was found in the early 1980s, it really turned the world of archaeology and early American history on its head. This meant that early Native Americans from 5,000 years ago had systems of measurement, some cursory knowledge of geometry, possible early knowledge of astronomy, and also hierarchy systems to successfully build these mounds, and it meant that these civilizations predated ancient Egyptian kingdoms and could have been just as complex. It also suggests that there was communication between tribes and sharing of customs, as these mounds start popping up all over North America after the time that Watson Brake was carbon dated to. And as time went on, indigenous people used these type of structures in more complex ways. Many archaeologists have concluded that the Adena people of the woodland period used mounds as a ceremonial way to bury their most respected dead, as the archaeological digs from the Adena sites yielded human remains along with prehistoric artifacts and tools. It is thought that the Adena people would often build small mortuary structures when a person of note from their tribe died. After the structure was built with the deceased inside of it, personal items would then be placed in the structure to honor their lives, along with tools that could help the deceased in the afterlife. Then the structure and the body inside of it would be cremated, and specialized soil would be transported by baskets and placed on top of the site. When another person died, the exact same ritual would take place in the exact same location on top of where the last person was cremated. After a while, all these cremated remains and soil would be crafted into a mound shape, most likely for structural integrity. And because the dead would be buried here, it was also a sacred place for the Adena people to visit and feel one with the spirit world. The Adena people were thought to have survived from 500 BC to 100 AD, and were precursors to what was called the Hopewell tradition. The Hopewell tradition consisted of Native American cultures during the woodland period that all had communication with each other and would take part in trading. They even had trade routes where they'd travel along rivers and bodies of water to exchange goods from different regions of North America, all the way from Manitoba down to northern Florida. Eventually, in addition to burial mounds, some mounds were built into the shapes of animals that indigenous people worshipped, which would be called an effigy mound. And one mound that has really taken history and archaeology lovers by storm is the Great Serpent Mound near Peebles, Ohio. This effigy mound is 1,348 feet long and is in the shape of a serpent, and is the biggest serpent effigy mound in the entire world. Now here's where a debate is started, and historians and archaeologists find some disagreement. Some archaeologists believe that the Adena people did not build Serpent Mound. One man named Dr. Brad Lepper, who's the curator of archaeology at the Ohio History Connection, noted that the Adena people did not have much serpent imagery in the artwork that has been found from that period, and he believes that the four ancient people had actually built Serpent Mound. The four ancient people were a Native American culture that existed after the Adena people, roughly from 1000 to 1700 AD. Dr. Brad Lepper was on a podcast called The Ancients, and it was here that he said he believes that the Adena people had built burial mounds around where the site of Serpent Mound is, but he thinks that the four ancient people built the Great Serpent Mound around 1100 AD. The reason this point is debated is because carbon dating of the area revealed charcoal that was dated back to the woodland period when the Adena culture lived around this land. But there were two other pieces of charcoal found at the Serpent Mound site that were carbon dated back to the Fort Ancient period. Dr. Brad Lepper also contests this carbon dating, saying that the material that was carbon dated by these archaeologists was actually organic sediment and not charcoal. So the theory is, according to Dr. Lepper, the Adena culture most likely set up burial mounds around this area, but then the four ancient people built the actual effigy mound that is now called the Great Serpent Mound. It is important to note that some archaeologists disagree with Dr. Lepper, but Dr. Lepper's most convincing point is that the four ancient people had tons of artwork depicting serpents and animals as part of their beliefs, and the Adena people didn't, which makes me believe Dr. Lepper more than these other archaeologists. But, like I said, all of this history is still very much up for debate. Fun fact, the Wisconsin Historical Society said that there's over 3,200 animal effigy mounds in the upper Midwest, including some in Wisconsin and Michigan, which is crazy to me, because I was never taught this in school. I've lived my whole life in the Midwest, and I never knew that there were all of these animal-shaped mounds built by Native Americans all around me, until I started researching this. Now, why would the Fort Ancient people build a 1,348-foot mound in the shape of a serpent in southern Ohio? Well, Dr. Brad Lepper believes that this has to do with their belief in the Great Horned Serpent, or a mythical serpent creature that lived in the underworld and gave women the power of creation. You see, when you follow this effigy mound to the head of the serpent, it looks as if the serpent is putting its mouth on an oval, and Dr. Brad Lepper believes that this oval is supposed to represent a woman's vulva. Huh? Apparently, the Fort Ancient people believed that a great horned serpent lived in the underworld, and anything below ground or underwater in a lake could be considered part of the underworld. The Fort Ancient people also believed that the great horned serpent had the power of creation, and before people populated the earth, there was one woman who was the mother creator. And this serpent then mated with this woman, which then gave all women the power of creation. So that is why it's believed that Great Serpent Mound is supposed to be a gigantic serpent mating with a female vulva, thus depicting the Fort Ancient story of creation. This belief is backed up by the fact that there are cave drawings, specifically at Picture Cave in Missouri, that also tell the story of a serpent mating with a woman, giving her the power of creation. It is thought that there used to be an altar in the center of this oval, and Native Americans would come here to make offerings by putting things on top of the altar and then burning them, and then those offerings would go into the underworld to the Great Horned Serpent. And the shape of the serpent mound seems to line up with the solstices, just like many other prehistoric mounds built in the United States. The head of the serpent apparently points towards where the sun sets during the summer solstice. Serpent Mound was also built within a 256 to 330 million year old crater made by a meteor. And most archaeologists believe this crater is what drew indigenous people to the area. This crater has a rim of 8.7 miles or 14 kilometers, so that'd be like if you cloned Mark Ruffalo 7,920 times and made him and all of his clones lay in a gigantic circle in southern Ohio. In 1980, the National Park Service designated this crater as a National Natural Landmark, and the NPS now calls it the Serpent Mound Crypto-Explosive Structure. Most archaeologists believe that the Fort Ancient people existed either until the mid-1600s or the early to mid-1700s, and it's reported that they never made contact with European colonizers. But there is proof that they had traded with many of the tribes around the area, and therefore most likely passed along some of their beliefs to them. And or some of these tribes directly descended from the Fort Ancients and inherited their culture. It's thought that in the mid-1600s, the Fort Ancient people experienced large waves of infectious diseases after Spanish explorers made contact with other Native Americans in North America. Spanish explorers brought diseases with them that were then passed on to Native Americans who didn't have any immunity to these diseases at this time. And because all of these Native Americans traded with each other, these diseases were then passed on to tribes like the Fort Ancients. The belief of the Great Horned Serpent is not that dissimilar to Mishipeshu, or the underwater panther that the Anishinaabe people around the Great Lakes believed in. Mishipeshu means the Great Lynx in the language of the Ojibwe, and Mishipeshu is a gigantic underwater panther that lives on Michipacatan Island in Lake Superior, but would also roam the deepest parts of the lake and cause storms and bad weather. And, as I noted in my video on the tragedy of the Edmund Fitzgerald, Native Americans around the Upper Peninsula were mining copper to make tools well before European colonizers had gotten there, and they believed that Mishipeshu was a protector of this copper. If you got greedy and took too much copper, Mishipeshu would come for vengeance. The Great Horned Serpent is also not that dissimilar to the belief of the Anyare, which is a dragon-like snake that breathes both poison and fire, according to Mohawk culture. The Mohawk believed the Anyare lived in all of the Great Lakes, including Lake Erie. The Mohawk tribe were a part of a larger group of Native Americans around the Great Lakes region, and that is the Iroquois. The Iroquois originally consisted of 5 and eventually 6 different nations, including the Mohawk tribe, that had settled around the Great Lakes. Other tribes within the 6 nations believed in the Jodi Quado, which is essentially the same as the Great Horned Serpent. So what I'm telling you is, it was a common thread amongst all the Native Americans in the Great Lakes region that some mythical snake creature lived in the Great Lakes. And this belief was actually quite important to the survival of Native Americans in pre-colonial America. Even if these horned serpents weren't real, it was an important cautionary tale that led to indigenous people taking several precautions when they traveled the Great Lakes. The Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy traded with many European settlers as they came to the area, and it wouldn't be a stretch to believe that while these tribes were trading with Europeans, they might have told them to beware of the beast in the lake, and therefore their superstitions were most likely passed along to European settlers. So how did the majority of post-colonial Americans eventually find out about Serpent Mound? Well, the first published surveys of Serpent Mound were in 1848 when two archaeologists by the name of Ephraim George Squire and Edwin Hamilton Davis wrote a book called Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. Edwin Davis was born in Chillicothe, Ohio in 1810, the same place where Thomas Worthington built the Adena Mansion in 1807, where Worthington discovered a burial mound himself. Edwin Davis eventually became a doctor and opened up a practice in Chillicothe, Ohio. But he had a great fascination in history and archaeology and collect artifacts that he found around the area. Davis also had great interest in the mound sites that were reported around Ohio. Ephraim Squire came to Chillicothe, Ohio in 1845 after hearing about these mound sites, and he noticed that no one had published actual surveys on these sites. So the two men eventually met each other and decided to survey these sites and publish their findings in their book, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. Although Squire and Davis believed these sites were made by recent Native Americans, their editor, Joseph Henry, who was the first secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, was frankly quite racist and thought that recent Native Americans could not be smart enough to build such complex earthworks. And so Henry decided to not keep much of Squire and Davis's opinions on the origins of the mounds in the book. Instead, focusing on the descriptions of the mounds and the scientific research that Squire and Davis conducted, as archaeology and anthropology were relatively new practices in the academic world at the time. As Ohio was growing in population and expanding in the mid to late 1800s, many of the effigy mounds around the Midwest were being built on and destroyed. Luckily, Serpent Mound was not touched between 1848 and 1885, when an archaeologist from Harvard by the name of Frederick Ward Putnam came to Ohio to investigate the effigy mounds found around the area. By 1886, with help from several wealthy donors, Putnam purchased 60 acres at and around the Great Serpent Mound with hopes of preserving one of the great wonders of the modern world. By 1900, the site of Serpent Mound was then donated by Frederick Ward Putnam to the Ohio State Archaeological and Historical Society, which was eventually turned into the Ohio Historical Society. And this is how the Great Serpent Mound has been preserved to this day. So how does all of this connect to Bessie? Well, the legend of the Great Horned Serpent is eerily similar in description to Bessie. And as I said, all of these beliefs had been passed down from generations of indigenous people and spread to Native Americans all over the Midwest. Of course, we all know that Europeans would go on to colonize America and kill millions of Native Americans either by slaughtering them and or by infectious disease. But it seemed to reason that some of the local folktales from these indigenous people stuck with them. So, in 1793, we get our first alleged sighting of a lake monster in Lake Erie from a European settler. According to oral history, a captain of the SS Felicity was shooting at ducks near Sandusky, Ohio, the same place where Cedar Point is, and his shot startled a large serpent in Lake Erie. He described it as more than 16.5 feet in length and no longer in width than a rod, which would also be 16.5 feet. Ohio did not become a state until March 1st, 1803, so there were not many newspapers in the state in the early 1800s, and therefore not many published reports of strange things happening on Lake Erie. That is, until July 31st, 1818, when a man by the name of Simon Honesty wrote a letter called The Lake Serpent in the very first edition of the Cleveland Gazette and Commercial Register, the first newspaper to be opened in Cleveland, Ohio. And before you judge what this letter says, just remember that this man's name is Simon Honesty, so he couldn't tell a lie, for honesty was his namesake. According to the article, Simon Honesty reported, quote, "Much has been said of the serpent that infests our seaboard and strikes the mariner with fear, reverence, admiration, and astonishment. But nothing as yet has been said of that monster which infests the beautiful and almost unparalleled waters of Lake Erie. Now the summer has passed for more than 3 years, but that one of the most terrific of all sea monsters ever in existence has been seen in different parts of this lake." Unquote. Honesty then went on to say, quote, Yesterday morning, as soon as the sun had dispelled for the darkness of the night, being on board the sloop Speculation, Theodore J. Shaver, master, off-point lookout, I discovered, at a distance of about a mile from the vessel, the lake being very smooth about us, a violent moving of the water. I immediately gave the alarm, being the only one on deck at the time when all on board. Both sailors and passengers came immediately above. At first, it was supposed to be a waterspout, but soon, on its approaching us nearer, we discovered to our great surprise that it was a species of a wonderful sea serpent. Its head and tail were erected and raised at equal distances from the water, which was, as near as we could judge, about 50 feet. Then apparently, according to Honesty, the people that were too scared left the deck and ran to the hull of the ship, and those who were courageous enough to defend the ship then got weapons, preparing for the sea serpent to attack the ship. Honesty then went on to say, quote, "The serpent, with all that energy which is natural to his satanic majesty's subjects, approached the bark, and when, within about 10 rods of the sloop, he stretched his head forward, as though he was anxious about his choice, not observing Captain Shaver on the deck," unquote. And the lake serpent then, quote, "sent forth his forked tongue and hissed out all the damning curses he was master of, then turning, lashed the water with his tremendous tail, until it foamed as when agitated by the most violent gale. He then immediately disappeared and was not afterwards seen on our voyage," unquote. Signed, Simon Honesty, Point Lookout, July 27th, 1818. So there's many point lookouts around the whole world, and I can't really find one around modern-day Ohio that's around Lake Erie, so I'm just going to guess this is in the South Bay region of Ohio. Now, in all Simon honesty, why the hell would someone write the paper with this claim, which I'm guessing could be backed up by all these other people on board? It mentions a captain was there and names the ship. So if this was a complete lie, then it could sully the names of everyone on board and the shipping company. Well, oddly enough, the next time I see a report on the sloop Speculation was in the Morning Chronicle of London. Now, I'm not 100% sure this is the exact same boat, but this account says that an officer stopped the boat in the Swale in the Thames estuary, and this officer found 300 casks of contraband spirits and 20 bales of tobacco. So if this is the same ship, it would seem these sloop boys were doing a bit of the boozing. You boys doing a bit of boozing? Sucking down grandma's cough medicine? Also, the letter describes that this lake serpent had a forked tongue and a head that could slink forward at least 10 rods. Now, a rod is actually a unit of measurement, and one rod is equivalent to 5.5 yards, and 55 yards would equal 165 feet. So, if this lake serpent was around 50 feet and somehow slinked its head forward 165 feet, then that means that this bad boy had one of the most elastic necks that ever existed. Now, Simon Honesty did mention that the past 3 summers, other people have reported the same lake monster lurking in Lake Erie. So even if him and his crew were a bunch of drunks, the people of South Bay, Ohio, had been talking about this Lake Erie monster for at least a few years at this point. There's obviously no physical proof of this in the form of skeleton, or else this would be all the rage with modern-day archaeologists. But if we go back to what the Native Americans believed, they had said that there was a mythical Great Horned Serpent that lived in the underworld. If you believe in mythical beings, then that means it could appear and disappear as it pleases, and it would leave no skeletons at the bottom of the lake. And it would make a seemingly preposterous story of a 50-foot snake prolonging its neck 165 feet maybe a little more believable to people. If you look up the word sea monster or lake monster on newspapers.com between the years of 1800 and 1900, there's reports from all over the world about different sea and lake serpents. There's reports in Lake Superior, and Lake Michigan, and New England, and all over Europe. In fact, a Great Lakes ship was even named Lake Serpent, and one could assume it was named this because of all the rumors and scuttlebutt about lake monsters around lakeside and seaside towns at the time. Most of these descriptions of sea serpents or lake monsters are similar to the description of a plesiosaurus, a marine reptile from the early Jurassic period that has been extinct for millions of years. Many descriptions will note these monsters are reptilian-looking with a long neck and flippers. The first full skeleton of the plesiosaurus was found by fossil hunter Mary Anning in December of 1823, so this was around the same time that stories of a lake monster were popping up around Lake Erie. But Mary Anning was British, and it's unlikely that the mariners and fishermen in Ohio were aware of her work in 1818 before she even discovered the first full fossil of a plesiosaurus. Stories of large sea serpents in Europe and the Middle East go back to biblical times and Nordic paganism, so these stories were hardly unique to European immigrants in Ohio at this point. Not to mention, there was cave carvings and art that depicted large serpents all around the globe. One thing I will note from reading many of these stories is that most of them read like fan fiction, even if they're coming from sources that seem legitimate, such as captains of ships or multiple people in different areas at the same time. One article in the Clyde Enterprise of Sandusky, Ohio on May 26, 1892 read, quote, "There's a sea serpent in Lake Erie, and Clyde fishermen should be careful when they go angling for scaly bass, lest this monster dee 'em up." It went on to say, quote, "A large snake supposed to be a sea serpent was seen in Lake Erie in the vicinity of Locust Point on Monday evening, May 16th. It was first seen by fishermen about 4 miles from shore. Later in the day, it was seen in a cove in the shore near the mouth of a small creek. It was seen by 2 men. It appeared to be floating on the shallow water near the lake. It was described to be about 25 feet long and about 1½ feet in diameter, through the largest part. Its head was large and flat. About 5 feet from its head, there appeared to be several large fins or flippers. Its color was black, mottled with brown spots. It did offer to molest the men, but swam out into deep water, where it has not been seen since." Unquote. So do all these people simply enjoy making up tall tales? I'm a bit of a skeptic, but due to the frequency of these reports and the similar description of these reports, I wouldn't call you crazy if you truly believed you saw a plesiosaurus-like lake monster roaming Lake Erie. When I get into my theories at the end of this video, I will address what these people possibly saw. The first reported story of the Lake Erie serpent in the 20th century was in 1931, when several people in Sandusky reported seeing something that looked like, quote, "a row of kegs," unquote, and as they drew near, the kegs vanished before a head like an alligator appeared. Going back to our Native American folklore connection here, this would align with another effigy mound in Granville, Ohio called the Alligator Effigy Mound, built by the Fort Ancient people. Some indigenous history folks believe that this effigy mound was mistakenly called an alligator, when really it was another serpent mound depicting the Great Horned Serpent. It seems that this tale spread around Ohio quickly, and people started trying to search for this lake serpent. And one day, on July 22nd, 1931, 2 self-described Cincinnati cement salesmen by the name of Frank Bagintos and Clifford Wilson found an 18-foot python in Lake Erie. Bagintos and Wilson were apparently in East Bay between Sandusky and Cedar Point when they wandered upon this 18-foot serpent before they hit the snake in the back of the head with an oar paddle. They then rowed back to shore and put it in a packing box, which they nailed shut. At first, they were trying to get a reward from the locals for finding this lake serpent. When no reward was offered, they eventually put this 18-foot python on display at Cedar Point and charged people 15 cents a pop to gaze upon it. That was until Clifford Wilson's uncle, Al Nice, a fire chief in Columbus, Ohio, got wind of this and called out his nephew saying, "Cement salesman? Nothing. Cliff's a carnival man." Clifford Wilson, now outed as a carny, then took the snake back from Cedar Point, curled it into his car, and, quote, drove to Cleveland to see about some advertisements, unquote. It would seem that both Wilson and Bagintos planted the snake, which may have been an Indian python, and swindled people into giving them money to look at it. You see, at this time in 1931, carnivals were importing these exotic snakes in large numbers. But more to the point, this story really shows how the people around Ohio may have been making up some stories for monetary purposes. We then get to the year of 1933 when the tale of the Loch Ness Monster was first created. Now, if you aren't aware of the origins of the Loch Ness Monster, which I'm sure many of you are, so I'll keep this brief, in 1933, a man named George Spicer wrote an article in a British newspaper called The Courier. Spicer said he had seen a large monster in Lake Loch Ness in Scotland, and after this article was written, which was most likely a hoax inspired by a plesiosaurus-looking monster in the movie King Kong, many more people then started sending in accounts of seeing this lake monster and became a craze in the Scottish and London newspapers. Through these accounts in 1933, most locals settled on the name the Loch Ness Monster. The people of Ohio, knowing that for years there had been reports of a serpent monster in Lake Erie, apparently got jealous of all the attention this lake monster was getting in Scotland. And by January of 1934, an article was written in the Sandusky Register basically saying, "Hey, don't you remember we have a lake monster too?" Respectfully, this article did note the hoax carried on by the carnies. More fuel was added to the fire of the Loch Ness Monster when a London gynecologist by the name of Robert Kenneth Wilson took a fake photograph of a toy submarine in April of 1934 and sent it to the Daily Mail to be published. And this photo was not exposed as a fake for several decades. So I'm guessing the people of Ohio were saying, "Hey, why not try to get some more tourism over here and say that we're still seeing a gigantic lake monster in Lake Erie?" These stories then seem to really peter out in Ohio the next few decades after the 1930s. There's maybe an article once a decade talking about the Lake Erie Serpent, so that is evidence that it was still folklore in the area throughout the 20th century. But it's also important to note that the second industrial revolution took place at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, and Cleveland really started to take off as an industrial town. The Cuyahoga River running through Cleveland and leading up to Lake Erie had many factories along it that polluted the waters. It apparently became so polluted that it was killing fish in the Cuyahoga River and Lake Erie on top of deforming them. There was trout with 3 eyes and pike with 1 eye, not to mention there was large amounts of trash that would float down the river and into Lake Erie. And all this pollution made certain species endangered and even led other species to extinction. This all led up to June 22nd, 1969, when, quote, an oil slick caught fire on the Cuyahoga River just southeast of downtown Cleveland, Ohio, unquote. And Ohioans, sick of their river and lake being polluted, complained so much that this became one of the catalysts for Richard Nixon to create the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. And this would then lead to the passing of the 1972 Clean Water Act and the 1972 Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which helped clean up the Great Lakes and establish certain standards for drinking water. Stories of the Lake Erie Monster really start to pick up again in 1985, when there was reportedly 6 different sightings in Lake Erie. One report in the News Herald of Port Clinton, Ohio said, quote, the Lake Erie Monster, sighted several weeks ago near Cleveland, may be 35 feet long and look like a log covered with bumps, unquote. It seems that the Cleveland Plain Dealer was really the paper that was behind the reporting on this lake monster. This article on June 21st, 1985, wrote of the Lake Erie Monster in prose-like fashion, saying, quote, every few years the monster will scare the hide off an unsuspecting boater, only when the water is very still, reflecting the light blue sky and white clouds on its greenish-brown surface will the monster attack. It lurks far from shore, barely visible at a distance. As it nears a boat, the dark green humps appear black and slimy, stretching for 20 or 30 yards, moving almost silently in an undulating motion as it tracks hapless sailors. Only the gurgling of the boat moving slowly through the water is heard until a shout from the deck warns the rest of the crew, unquote. Now, I'm not accusing the Cleveland Plain Dealer of anything per se, but this folktale of the old Lake Erie Monster seems to coincide with a film that was put into production in 1985 by Cannon Films called It Ate Cleveland. The plotline was apparently about, quote, the polluted waters of Lake Erie spawning a ravenous monster with an appetite for Ohioans, unquote. It was to be directed by comedy director Gene Quintano, who directed such films as Loaded Weapon 1, and was to be written by a comedy screenwriter, Dana Olson, who ended up writing George of the Jungle and Inspector Gadget. So it would have conceivably been a comedy and a spoof off the famous Japanese film Godzilla. The buzz around this movie had local newspapers even asking people to send in stories about what restaurant the monster would eat at in Cleveland, rewarding the top 5 suggestions with a t-shirt. It Ate Cleveland ended up swimming too close to shore as the entertainment company that owned the rights to Godzilla, Toto, got wind of it and threatened to sue Cannon Films if they made this movie. So Cannon Films, not wanting to be sued, tried to rework the idea of the film a bit to distance itself from Godzilla. But that was all for naught, as it was sadly put out of production by 1987. Also during this time, we finally got our namesake for the Lake Erie Monster. I can't find the exact article and date as it somehow has disappeared from newspapers.com, but a local newspaper in Port Clinton, Ohio called The Beacon ran a contest to finally name this lake serpent sometime between 1985 and 1987. And the name that won was South Bay Bessie with no I. And that name was chosen because there's actually a nuclear power plant in Port Clinton called Davis-Besse that first became operational in 1978. That power plant was owned by both Cleveland Electric Illuminating and Toledo Edison. Davis came from the name of Toledo Edison chairman John K. Davis, and Bessie came from Cleveland Electric Illuminating chairman Ralph M. Bessie. So, you have a tie-in with a local business on top of it rhyming with Nessie, the nickname for the Loch Ness Monster. Although It Ate Cleveland was put out of production, that doesn't mean this craze went away. By the time 1990 hit, a man named Thomas Solberg that owned Huron Lagoons Marina offered a $5,000 reward for proof of the Lake Erie Monster. And in 1990, a toll-free hotline was set up by John Shafter, the editor of The Beacon from Port Clinton. The toll-free hotline allowed people to call in and report sightings of South Bay Bessie, and several Ohioans did just that. And so with all these reported sightings, a name that was given to the monster, local newspapers drumming up the folktale of South Bay Bessie, and local businesses playing into the fun of it all, the tale of Bessie the Lake Erie Monster was solidified. Tourists from far and wide would come to the South Bay region of Ohio and to Sandusky, not only for Cedar Point and the views of Lake Erie, but also to try to find the newest creature that was added to the cryptid lexicon. Although if you ask most cryptid believers, they'll tell you that South Bay Bessie is just a cheap ripoff of the Loch Ness Monster. But if they ever tell you that, tell them that this beast has been sighted in Lake Erie since the days of indigenous people, when Native Americans told tales of a monster in the Great Lakes. Every once in a while there's another report of Bessie in the South Bay, although the newspapers have mostly stopped reporting on it. But if you talk to people that live around the region, they'll most likely know somebody who claims to have seen the creature. Bessie even made her way into hockey. In 2007, the Columbus Blue Jackets named their AHL team the Cleveland Monsters, designing their logo to look like Bessie. And one of the biggest breweries to run out of Cleveland, called Great Lakes Brewing Company, made an Imperial IPA beer called the Lake Erie Monster. So, Bessie's still alive and well in Ohio branding. As for the theories about what the lake monster could actually be, well, I have a few. Now, if you believe in Native American folklore and the mythical Great Horned Serpent, then that's an easy explanation. Close the book, that explains pretty much all these sightings and everything that came along with it. But if you don't believe in mythical sea serpents, I propose theory number 1. Earlier in this piece, I said that the Cuyahoga River in Lake Erie got pretty dirty in the mid-20th century. So dirty that was one of the catalysts for the creation of the EPA, and Congress passed the Clean Water Act to ensure that the Cuyahoga River and Lake Erie became cleaner. But due to rivers gathering up a lot of litter sometimes, and the Cuyahoga River emptying out into Lake Erie, I don't think it's that crazy to think that there could be piles of floating debris and trash in Lake Erie. This could account for some people saying that they saw a reptile-like creature with its neck protruded from the water. Maybe you're cruising along Lake Erie, some piece of debris is sticking out of the water, and a boater mistakes this for a large lake serpent. My problem with this theory is that it wouldn't account for boaters saying that the lake monster was moving quickly through the water. Floating debris is moving, obviously, but not quick enough to be mistaken for a fish. My second theory is that exotic fish and/or exotic reptiles are being kept by the people of Ohio, very similar to those carnival people that said they captured the Lake Erie Monster, only for it to be an Indian python taken from a carnival. And these exotic fish or reptiles are either accidentally being released into the lake or purposely being released into the lake as a prank. There's been a few accounts of bull shark washing up on the beaches of the Great Lakes, and for a while, people around the Midwest thought large fish, such as bull shark, were swimming in from the ocean through the St. Lawrence River or somewhere else like the Mississippi River, and living in the Great Lakes for a short while before inevitably dying because it's not their natural habitat. But many scientists around the region have now theorized that these washed up bull shark were most likely a prank where people bought exotic sharks and released them into the lake. So, in theory, people could be doing the same with other animals, which is an incredibly messed up thing to do, to go to the length of buying an exotic animal only to release it into a habitat that it can't survive in, but people have done worse things. Even if it's an accident that these exotic fish or reptiles slither away into Lake Erie, what is the point of buying these things? You're going to be the Great Lakes Tiger King, so just let them be, man. And now for my last two theories, which I'll say are theories 3A and 3B because they sort of fall under the same theory, or what I'll deem the most believable theories. If you are unfamiliar with the Great Lakes region, you may not know that we have gigantic fish in our lakes called sturgeon. Sturgeon can get up to 7 feet long and weigh up to 200 to 300 pounds. Sturgeon are mostly bottom dwellers in lakes, but sometimes they do come up to the surface for food or to spawn their eggs, and sometimes they even leap out of the water in the process of mating or communicating to other sturgeon or to shed eggs. Now, 7 feet is much smaller than what most sightings of Bessie state, as I've mostly read accounts of anywhere from 15 all the way up to 60 feet, with the average being around 30 to 35 feet. But if a boater was seemingly cruising along Lake Erie and was surprised by one of these gigantic sturgeon leaping out of the water, and that same sturgeon then returned to the water with another group of sturgeon all swimming in congregation, then it wouldn't be crazy to think that these fish could be one large lake serpent. Also, as I mentioned before, Lake Erie became incredibly polluted in the 20th century, and this led to lake sturgeons becoming an endangered species. That could account for why there were so many more sightings of this lake serpent in the 19th century before it kind of teetered off in the mid-20th century. The rarity of actually seeing a lake sturgeon near the surface of the water could lead to the conclusion that boaters would be incredibly surprised and scared when they saw a group of these gigantic fish, and their imaginations could run away with them. Now, does that account for these reports of a reptile-like monster sticking its head out of water and stretching its neck all the way out to a boat dozens of feet away? No, not really. But I would wager to guess that these more fantastical tales were made up either for monetary purposes or to be a hotshot around town with a tall tale, while other stories that aren't so fantastical were actually just a case of mistaken identity. Now this next theory is not too dissimilar from the last theory, but just changed the type of fish, so I'll call this theory 3B. This actually comes from a charter boat captain by the name of Tom Gaudern from Port Clinton, Ohio. I found this in the newspaper The News Messenger in 1985. When asked about the sightings of the Lake Erie monster, Gaudern said that he saw the same phenomenon on a fishing trip last summer. He went on to say that it was most likely several large carp swimming in a line. Quote, "They came real close to the boat, and I have to admit it looked a bit eerie, but we could see that they were just large carp. You could see the ridges of their backs, and they were swimming close together. There were 3 or 4 large carp in a line playing follow the leader. People see things like that from a distance, and then their imaginations get away from them. I've done a lot of diving in the lake over the years. A carp will swim right up to you. I guess they assume if you're in the water, you must be one of them." Unquote. Now, it makes sense if a person was startled or maybe going a bit heavy on the boozing that they could mistake 3 or 4 large fish for one long serpent. Or, if you were a Native American living around the area at the time, these fish are probably much bigger than anything you've seen in the lake. Maybe these Native Americans saw serpents living around Ohio at the time and mistook 3 or 4 large carp or sturgeon in the lake for one large serpent. It'd be completely understandable to do that, especially when you had already heard folktales from others in the area. So what do we take away from this whole story? Well, I find it to be a fascinating story of how indigenous history has so much effect on colonial and post-colonial history in the United States. I truthfully believe that this story of a lake serpent was passed down from indigenous people and then given to early colonial Americans, and this carried through all this time for hundreds of years. But this is also an interesting story of a conspiracy getting out of whack, partly by truthful belief in the conspiracy, but also by people spreading a tall tale for financial gain. Out of all the conspiracies that people use for monetary purposes these days, I'd say this is one of the more innocent cases I have come across. If local businesses around Ohio wanted to drum up the story of a lake monster just so some tourists could come to the area and spend money at their hotels and restaurants, I don't take any offense to that. But it's definitely an all too common phenomenon in the United States that sometimes can lead to people spending money they don't have and emptying their bank accounts because they believed in a lie. That's when conspiracies can really hurt people. Either way, I'd still like to hear more modern day sightings of Bessie, and if there's true believers still out there. So if you have a story, comment below, or if you just enjoy some Ohio folklore, please share this video to others who might be interested. And as always, please subscribe and check back next month for more tales of the Great Lakes, when I will unravel the Lake Superior Kinross UFO incident, a tale of an Air Force pilot who suddenly went missing after trying to track down an unidentified flying object. Have a good day, everyone, and don't get eaten by a gigantic lake monster.